You don't have to be handsome, rich, or socially dominant to seduce anyone. You just need something that others don't have. The ability to activate pleasure in the brain of the person in front of you without saying a single word about yourself. Does that sound like an exaggeration? This is exactly how CIA spies create alliances, how salespeople manipulate buyers, and how true masters of seduction become emotional addictions rather than passions. The uncomfortable truth is, the more you talk about yourself, the less interesting you become. And paradoxically, the less you reveal, the more irresistible you become. As long as you know how to make the other person talk about themselves in a pleasurable way. This is the core of one of the most dangerous secrets of social psychology, informational superiority. A concept refined by intelligence services to gain the trust of hostile targets, and which, when adapted to the game of attraction, transforms you into the most seductive type of presence, the empathetic enigma. The one who listens to you so accurately that you forget to ask who he is. Because deep down, it doesn't matter. You just want to keep feeling what you feel around him. Dopamine has already decided for you. But here's the contradiction that few have the courage to admit. What we seek most is to be heard, and what we do least is listen. We live in a performance culture where every sentence is an attempt to impress, where every personal story seeks applause, and that's why most fail miserably at creating real connection. Because no one wants to compete for a stage when all they need is an audience. This is the first secret the CIA teaches you. People are programmed to trust those who validate them and not those who present themselves as spectacular. When I first heard this, I thought it was an exaggeration, a cheap trick of emotional manipulation. But when I started observing the masters, the real ones, the ones who don't need to prove themselves, I realized that they all use this same structure, intuitively or not. Questions that trigger emotion, validations that generate pleasure, silence that awakens mystery, and none of them made big speeches about themselves. They let the other person reveal themselves. And by doing so, they took invisible control of the interaction, not by force, but by intelligence. Nietzsche wrote, "What is good? Whatever increases our sense of power, and few feelings increase our inner power as much as the feeling of being understood effortlessly." That's exactly what the CIA hack does. It makes the other person feel so understood, so valued, and so in tune with you that they simply let their defenses down. And when the defenses are down, seduction kicks in. But here's a warning. This is not a trick to get a WhatsApp number. It's a system of profound influence. It's an access code to the unconscious mind. And like any powerful tool, it can be used to build or to destroy. What you're going to learn today is how to use this code with strategic awareness to become magnetic, unforgettable, and above all, to leave a lasting emotional mark on any social or intimate interaction. You'll learn how to turn common questions into portals of connection. The biggest lie of modern seduction is this, that to attract someone, you need to impress. Show your worth, tell epic stories, have a sculpted physique, a social resume worthy of a TV series character. The world sells you the idea that winning someone over is like a job interview. The more you show, the more chances you have. But this logic is emotional suicide because it starts from a silent and toxic premise. You still need to prove that you are worthy. But real attraction, the visceral kind, does not operate on this logic. It is illogical, unconscious, and brutally primitive. And if you are still trying to be interesting, it is because you have not understood one thing. People do not fall in love with someone who is interesting. They fall in love with someone who makes them feel interesting. The trick is not to be a show. It is to be the stage where the other person feels like the protagonist. And that is where the most powerful technique of silent seduction comes in. Strategic validation. And no, we are not talking about generic compliments. We are talking about deep psychological mirroring to make someone feel seen on a level that even they themselves are not used to. And this is not done with ready-made phrases. It is done with active listening, emotional reading, and verbal precision. The CIA calls this verbal mirroring, but the principle is much older. In ancient Greece, Socrates already used questions to make the other person reveal themselves. And in the salons of Versailles, courtiers trained in charm learned to ask questions that seemed like disguised compliments. This is nothing new. The difference is that now we know why this works. It releases dopamine. Every time someone feels that they are being truly understood, the brain activates the reward circuit. The person feels validated. And here's the magic. When they associate this feeling with your presence, they want more of you. Even if they don't know why, they chase you emotionally because being with you is the same as feeling special. And this is the greatest social addition their island. So, how do you apply this in practice with what we call the cycle of 3? 3 simple moves that, when executed well, transform any ordinary conversation into an irresistible connection. First, an emotional question. Something that isn't just, "What do you do?" but that touches on something more internal. What do you love to do when no one is watching you? What was the lightest moment of your day so far? What would you do tomorrow if the world stopped and you were the only one? These questions are disarming because they don't have a logical objective. They open space for the subjective, and the unconscious loves that. Second, a deepening question. Here, you take what the person answered and dive deeper. This shows presence. It shows that you are truly listening. And this is the point where their brain starts to release dopamine with force. Example, I love to paint when I'm alone. And what exactly do you feel when you're painting? What keeps you so caught up in it? This type of question generates introspection. And introspection, when guided by another person, becomes a bond. It's as if you're helping her understand herself, and no one forgets who does this. Third, reflective validation. Here, you take what she said and transform it into a reflection of value, but with precision, not with empty compliments, with words that show that you understood. For example, I know a lot of people who are constantly chasing attention. The fact that you value solitary time to create is magnetic. It shows that you have your own world. That's rare. You're not saying that she's beautiful. You're saying that the way she experiences the world is enchanting, and that my friend is infinitely more powerful because it touches the ego. Yes, but it also touches the identity. It validates not only appearance, but essence. Now, understand the following. This sequence is not a magic formula. It's a structure. And like every structure, it needs to be adapted to the context. It's not about memorizing questions. It's about practicing active listening, observing nuances, and understanding that each person has a different door to open. Some open it through art, others through pain, others through humor. The key is always there. You just have to stop trying to show your brilliance and start seeing theirs. But here comes the interesting contradiction. Too much validation without challenge generates disinterest. The human mind needs contrast to stay focused. That's why validation needs to be followed by a light provocation, a subtle disagreement, a mirroring with friction. Just as gold needs fire to be purified, desire needs contrast to grow. For example, you can say, "You seem to me like someone who likes to control everything, even when you pretend you're not controlling." That's hypnotizing and a little dangerous. Here you mix validation, emotional reading, and light provocation. Result: you plant doubt, curiosity, and pleasure in the same sentence, and her mind will want more. Robert Greene said that the true seducer is not the one who impresses. It's the one who gently disturbs the other's ego, not with attacks, but with precise reading, with sentences that are like sharp knives. They cut with class, without leaving blood. Strategic validation is this, a dance between recognition and challenge, between the mirror and the mystery. And you know what's even more fascinating? The more you apply this, the less you talk about yourself. And the less you talk, the more enigmatic you become. And the more enigmatic, the more fascinating. It's the perfect paradox. The more you focus on the other person, the more they focus on you. But maybe you're thinking, isn't this manipulation? And here's the brutal reflection. Manipulation is when you lie to get something. What we're doing here is different. We're revealing layers that the person themselves hides from themselves. We're creating space for them to be seen. And let's face it, in a world of distraction, inflated ego, and superficiality, this is a rare gift. And whoever offers this kind of gift is not forgotten ever. Have you ever talked to someone for half an hour, left enchanted, and only later realized, I don't know anything about this person? But still, you feel like talking to them again to learn more, to go back? Logic doesn't explain it. Reason tries to resist, but something pulls you back. This something has a name, and it is one of the most discreet and devastating weapons in the psychology of seduction. Informational superiority. What the CIA understood, and what few seducers master, is that real power is not in showing off, but in collecting. True social dominance does not come from speaking well, but from making others talk with pleasure. Every time someone reveals intimate information, a feeling, a memory, They are giving you not only words but trust. And this trust is the hardest bond to break. Most people think that seducing is conquering, when in fact, seducing is being chosen without offering yourself. And to do that, you need to create a presence that arouses desire and comfort at the same time. An emotional space where the other person feels free to be who they are, but curious about who you are. It's a game of tension and absence. You're there, but you remain invisible. And for that very reason, you're unforgettable. Informational superiority works for two central reasons. The first is neurochemical. When someone talks about themselves and feels they're being understood, the brain activates dopamine and oxytocin, the hormones of pleasure and connection. But here's the fatal detail. The person who listens with presence is the one who becomes associated with this pleasure. In other words, the pleasure of the conversation is not about them, it's about you. The second reason is psychological mystery. Human beings desire what they don't understand, and they respect what they don't control. When you create this combination, a presence that generates pleasure and at the same time maintains mystery, you activate the most addictive duality of seduction. They feel intimate with you. And this ambiguity is an emotional magnet. The mind begins to project, to imagine, to fill in the gaps. And the more she projects, the more space you occupy in her head. Even if you've never told her anything about your life, this is power, pure power, but a silent kind, invisible, cold, lethal. And this is where we walk a fine line. Because this type of seduction, if misused, turns into high-level emotional manipulation. That's why it's essential to understand the difference between maintaining mystery and creating confusion. Mystery makes you provocative. Confusion makes you dishonest. The line is subtle, but intention is what separates the master from the charlatan. So, how do you apply this superiority in practice? First, with a reconfiguration of identity, you're not there to be discovered. You're there to discover. Your focus is not on being validated, it's on validating. Your goal is not to tell stories, it's to provoke revelations. Every time you do this, you collect precious information about the other person's insecurities, desires, fantasies, traumas, and emotional patterns. And this doesn't just give you an advantage, it gives you control. Second, you need to practice what I call guided curiosity. It's not asking just anything. It's asking as if you were investigating an emotional mystery, because every person holds within themselves a story that they haven't yet told in the right way. When you find that story and listen with real attention, you become something rare for that person. The first one who saw what no one else saw. And don't underestimate the power of this, because we live in a world where everyone wants to be heard, but no one knows how to listen. And when someone listens with quality, with precision, with presence, it becomes addictive. But be careful. This only works if you don't break the code of silence. From the moment you start explaining yourself too much, telling your story, justifying yourself, you lose your charm. You become just like everyone else, predictable. And predictability kills desire. The secret is in the alternation. Listen deeply and speak superficially. Throw in enigmatic phrases, fragments of truth, but never give away the whole picture. For example, you can say, "You seem like someone who has had to rebuild themselves in silence. Maybe that's why you have such control over everything." Here, you give insight but not context. You show reading but not explanation. And when she asks you, "And you, have you ever been through something like this?" you answer with a slight smile. "Maybe, but today I prefer to listen. The best stories are not mine." This is more than charm. This is elite social intelligence. It's the same kind of posture that charismatic leaders, brilliant therapists, and magnetic artists have. They say little, but when they do, they carry weight, because they have built the right stage before stepping onto it. Robert Greene speaks of this masterfully in The Art of Seduction. He claims that the seducer needs to master the power of absence, because what is scarce is valued, and what is valued is desired. Showing everything about yourself is like leaving a dessert on display in an open display case. The first fly spoils the charm, but when you save the best for the right moment, you transform every detail into something memorable. And here's a brutal insight. You only need 20% of someone's attention to dominate 80% of their perception of you. This is called exposure bias. The human mind fills in the gaps with what it desires. If you are enigmatic, kind, and provocative enough, it will fill in the gaps with projections. And projections are always more seductive than any truth you could tell. This is what turns conversations into addiction, interactions into memories. You become the one she remembers before going to sleep. Not because you said something amazing, but because you made her feel something rare, the pleasure of being listened to intelligently. But how do you maintain this without seeming artificial? The answer is simple: practice. Spies train for years to do this naturally, but you can start now. When you meet them next, resist the temptation to tell your story. Instead, enter as a silent observer. Ask deep questions, validate accurately, maintain the mystery. You'll see people will leave the conversation wanting to meet you again, even if they don't know why, because their brains have already associated your presence with the feeling of being unique. And remember, the less you reveal, the more power you retain. What separates a common conversation from an addictive experience? What turns a simple dialogue into something that resonates in the mind days later? The answer is not in the words themselves. It is in what they trigger, what they activate. And this activation has a name, a form, and a measurable effect. Dopamine, the molecule of anticipation, the hormone of pleasure and desire, the invisible weapon of modern seduction. If you have understood the power of validation and mastered the art of informational superiority, now you need to understand the biological engine that makes all this possible. Because we are not just talking about social strategy, we are talking about emotional neuroengineering, the intentional use of your words to activate chemical reactions in the other person's brain. Reactions that generate pleasure, comfort, curiosity, and addiction. And here is the brutality of the process. The human brain does not differentiate between a physical experience and a well-constructed emotional experience. In other words, when you conduct a conversation that activates dopamine, the other person's brain begins to associate you with the same reward circuit activated by sex, food, drugs, or victory. You become the trigger, you become the stimulus. And when that happens, logic dies, attachment is born. But be careful, dopamine is not love, it is not affection, it is not fondness. Dopamine is impulse, it is desire, it is movement toward a goal. And that means you can make someone feel attracted, interested, fascinated, even without ever touching them, even without revealing anything personal. Because dopamine doesn't need content, it needs context. The context in this case is your ability to create micro-experiences of validation, discovery, and mystery. Think like a movie screenwriter. Every line you say should generate a little anticipation, a slight discomfort, a clue without a conclusion. The human mind hates gaps, and you will use them as fuel. The more emotional gaps you leave, the more dopamine its brain releases trying to fill them. Practical example. You know what's weird? Sometimes, the sweetest people I've ever met had a deep anger that no one ever noticed. Pause. Silence. And the inevitable question arises in her mind. Is he talking about me? Or did he see that in me? This directed ambiguity is a bait. An unspoken question that forces her brain to explore further. And the more she explores, the more dopamine she releases. Another example. You have a look that seems to be holding a story that no one had the courage to ask. You are not stating anything. You are suggesting. And the suggestion, when done masterfully, is worth more than any statement because it gives space for the other person to fill with their own fantasy. And personal fantasies are always more powerful than imposed reality. That is where dopamine comes in strong because the brain begins to predict future emotional rewards. And every prediction of reward is a chemical trigger. This is the neurological basis of addiction, unresolved anticipation. When you become someone who constantly triggers this anticipation through cryptic questions, unexpected validations, well-placed silences, you literally become a source of dopamine. But there's more. When someone talks about themselves and feels they're being heard, the brain doesn't just release dopamine, it also releases oxytocin, the hormone of trust and bonding. And this combination is dangerous because now you're not just interesting, you're trustworthy. And when the brain combines desire with security, that's when deep attachment is born. You become the person with whom they feel they can be themselves, and at the same time, the person they haven't yet figured out. The brain's paradise, the ego's hell, the perfect territory for seduction. But to master this effect, you need to stop seeking attention and start mastering tension. Yes, tension. Because the brain only releases dopamine when there's movement towards something desired but not yet achieved. That's why seduction that works isn't the one that gives everything away. It's the one that provokes, that instigates, that brings closer and retreats, that turns on and off, like a psychological dance where every gesture has intention and every silence carries weight. Robert Greene wrote that a true seducer is an emotional theater director. He creates scenes, drives emotions, manipulates perceptions, but never loses control of the narrative. That's what we're doing here. Building emotional scenes where the other person feels special, seen, challenged, and intrigued, all at the same time. This overload of stimuli is what turns a simple conversation into a dopaminergic experience. But you might be wondering, what if this is used against me? The answer is, it probably has been. Advertising, social media, religious leaders, spiritual gurus, and even emotional manipulators use these strategies every day. The difference is that now you understand what's happening. And more importantly, you can use it consciously, not to control, but to create experiences of real value. Because in the end, dopamine only transforms into a legitimate connection if there's truth. If you're really present, if you're sincerely listening, if your words are aligned with what you're feeling, that's what separates the authentic seducer from the cheap manipulator, the intention behind the technique. Use this power responsibly, because when you learn to provoke pleasure in the brain of another person, you also take on the responsibility of not becoming addicted to ego, of not using it as a bargaining chip, but rather as a bridge of connection. And here is the brutal conclusion of this chapter. You don't need to be pretty. You don't need to be funny or confident. You just need to be the space where the other person feels pleasure in existing. When you become a catalyst for emotional dopamine, you stop chasing and you start being chased. Not out of need, but out of pure neurochemistry. And if you think this is an exaggeration, try it. Take the focus off yourself for a day. Practice the cycle of 3. Apply informational superiority and observe. The reactions will be almost mathematical because the human brain is predictable, but few have the courage to use it to their advantage. Now you know. You know that the game was never about looking interesting, but about being the reflection of where the other person feels special. That the key to a deep connection is not in your stories, your achievements, or your appearance. It's in your presence, in your listening, in the silence between your words. It's in how you lead the other person to a place where they rediscover themselves and associate you with this emotional rebirth. This is pure seduction and more. It's power. But here's the brutal question. Will you have the courage to use this power? Because the path you've taken so far has given you tools, strategies, understanding. But now the decision is yours. Because using this kind of influence requires something rare. It requires that you give up the habit of talking about yourself, that you resist the need to prove your worth, that you trust your silence as much as your speech. And that, my friend, is not easy because we are programmed to want approval, to seek applause, to sell ourselves all the time. But the more you try to sell yourself, the less value you have. Real seducers don't chase attention. They collapse it around them, not through effort, but through magnetism. And magnetism is born of awareness, of intention, of the ability to be the stage, not the show, of being the portal, not the protagonist. You become unforgettable when you understand that the other person doesn't want to know about your life. They want to know how you feel around you. That's the choice before you now. Continue being the guy who talks, who tries, who forces, or become the man who listens, who understands, who provokes. The kind of presence that enters a room and changes the energy without having to open his mouth. And if this video sparked something in you, a discomfort, a clarity, a memory, don't ignore it. Comment below. I choose to be magnetic. This is not just a video. It's a game changer for anyone who wants to play the game of influence and seduction with intelligence and strategy. Share it with someone who is still blindly trying to prove their worth. Maybe he still has salvation. And remember, seduction deep down has never been about conquering the other person. It has always been about dominating yourself. Because true power is making the other person fall in love with the version of themselves that appears when they are with you.